Appellation Elements. So I'm going to talk about a project I've been working on since the summer for the RDA Steering Committee, which was to look at the appellation elements, look at how the instructions should be arranged within the appellation elements. Started off with 96 elements to review and to produce some drafts for review for incorporation into the new toolkit. As Gordon indicated, what are appellations, names, titles, access points, identifiers, not IRIs. So that was off my plate. So to begin, I had, what were the elements, or what was the most important element? And there's a set of elements that begin with appellation of. And if you pop open the element reference on all of them, they indicate the domain, which is all of the RDA entities, and you see them all listed, and the range, which is the entity nomen. Okay, so we're used to thinking of just the name is just a string, the title is just a string. I eventually realized the same thing that Gordon was talking about is that, well, we really should just focus on the string. The nomen gets into other things we can say about that relationship of that string to that entity, and that's not what I was working on. Really, it was about the instructions for forming the strings. So one interesting aspect that popped up immediately was that each of the appellation elements had only one of the methods available to it. So, for example, if we're recording an unstructured description, what we're talking about are the names and titles in direct order as they appear in the sources of information. If we're talking about structured descriptions, we're talking about access points, which can be taken from a vocabulary encoding scheme or constructed using a string encoding scheme. And identifiers are identifiers. If you look at the definition, it's a string that is like a control number, and it has to be unique within a local system. So my work began with these 96 elements, and the first thing I did was I sorted by the size of the file. So I got a draft of the content for each of these elements, and I saw there were a lot that didn't have very much content, and there were a lot that had a lot of content. So so I thought, well, there looks like there's a bunch of easy ones that can be reviewed pretty quickly, but there are certainly groups that are going to take some time to review. So I divided them up into these groups. The easy 7. So if we go just going through them, the appellation of elements are essentially just boilerplate. Identifier for, I started that because there's one, the identifier for manifestation element that has content, and that's where you would find the instructions for recording an ISBN, for example. The rest essentially had boilerplate. Name of agent had some content that required some review. For the complex 7, and I'll get on to the next slide to explain why they were complex. So for person, I'm really looking at 6 elements, and for each RDA entity, I'm looking at 6 elements. So in terms of looking at the existing instructions in the current toolkit and how they should fit into this new structure, I needed to compare these side by side. So I worked out a 3x2 grid, and just going through that, name of person and preferred name of person, variant name of person, and the parallel line for the access point. something pops out here. If you look at the last example for manifestation, authorized access point for a manifestation. Well, if you look at that element, there really isn't very much there because there really hasn't been a practice of creating access points for manifestations. So within these groups, there were some cases where, okay, there's mostly boilerplate. It's left open for further development if the cataloging community so chooses. So taking a deeper dive into that first row, the names and titles under the unstructured description recording method. So that, well, a key point here is there's three elements. There's the name of the entity, there's the preferred name and the variant name. So it's a question of, well, the base element should really have the most general guidelines for recording that element. So that was a good place to reference the transcription guidelines. Getting into the preferred name, the key thing there was there were a group of instructions that dealt with the choosing of that preferred name, because there are often different names or forms of the name for the same entity. This was an interesting exercise in that there were places in the original toolkit that I thought, that shouldn't be in that spot. That's a choosing instruction. That should be brought together and put here. So this is the place where you're going to see some rearrangement of things. Basically just went through, said, that's a choosing instruction, it goes here. Anything left over after choosing the preferred name or title, that's the variant name. So that's actually fairly straightforward. And the only organization there is just the different types of variant names. And so you can list examples for those different types. So moved on to access points, which had a lot more issues, and there's still some issues to work through with those. Again, you have three elements: a base element, an authorized element, and a variant element. In terms of what goes into the base element, in terms of what instructions go there, the idea there, it should be the set of instructions that apply to all cases for access points. So the general guidelines where it makes sense. Obviously, selecting from a vocabulary encoding scheme, constructing using a string encoding scheme, that's a basic instruction. The option to include a value based on the name or title of the entity should be there. That's what most access points are built out of. And the key phrasing there is based on, because, and I didn't quite touch upon this, Gordon did earlier, is that the name and the preferred name is in direct order. Its name is found. So as soon as we are dealing with a structured description, we are making changes to what has been found. We are changes such as inverting name of a person, sometimes dropping bits, initial articles, for example. So the key idea is that you're taking the name as it's been found, but when you're making an access point, you're making changes, and any instructions that get into that are in access point instructions. They're instructions to make a structured description of that name or title. So the heading I used was changes or omissions to the name or title of the entity. When you get into additional elements to add to an access point, if you look at the instruction under the variant access points, they always say, oh, check the authorized access point. So it would make sense to say that's a general set of instructions that should be under the base access point element. Moving on to the authorized access point, the most central instruction is to use what you've chosen for the preferred name or title of the entity. So it functions like a filter. Many choices for changes or omission to a name or title that is the choice that you're going to make for the authorized access point. So those are found here. So the instructions for inverting the name of a person are found here. Likewise, there are a set of instructions to construct authorized access points in terms of what elements to add. And this is a new twist. Access points are elements, and they can include other access points. So when we're talking about additional elements, those can include the higher corporate body or the larger work. We're constructing a string out of different elements when we're creating those kinds of access points. Moving on to the variant access point. Well, basically anything left over, anything that hasn't been chosen as an authorized access point. One would expect to see any choices made for the variant name or title to be here, but there are actually many cases where you are using the preferred form, but using something else before or after it, or making a different change to that name or title. And there are variants, there are instructions to create variant access points to make different choices about what to add. A variant access point for work, add all of the other authors and make access points if it's a collaborative work, for example. So looking at what's in the beta toolkit right now for a very common example, the instruction to create an authorized access point for a single work by one agent. So you also see the new format for the instructions there as well, the condition option box format. The option to include the value of the authorized access point for the agents, followed by a value that is based on the preferred title of the work. Those should be numbered, but they're not in the current toolkit numbered that way. The word include I settled on because there were a bunch of words used. Combine appeared in several places, so I settled on that one word for all instructions for constructing access points. And the one benefit I saw was that you could still add more elements, or other terms after this if you need to distinguish that access point. So when we're saying include, it's not just necessarily those two elements. And if you pop open the examples below, you can see our traditional authorized access points for works. So looking at the structure, this is the element authorized access point for work. Several of these are quite lengthy, and so a table of contents has been used to organize the content. And this should look fairly familiar to most of you. You can see there's a very natural organization here: single work, collaborative work, compilations of work, special cases when the authorship is unknown or uncertain, parts of works. So these are fairly just basic routine instructions, and they don't really get into there are a lot of special cases throughout. You see one here, manuscript with no title. If you look at where, that instruction is not currently found here, but it has to go here because this is an instruction for constructing an access point out of several elements. So that was the part of the exercise of going through and saying, well, that's you're dealing with multiple elements. That can't stay in the name of entity or preferred name instruction. There can be references. And there's cases where it just referred here if you're looking for that instruction, because you still have to record some name, some title. Another set of table of contents, the authorized access point for person, looks out of place because you would think this should all be under preferred name, but no, these are instructions for making changes to the name as it's been found. essentially the exact same instructions that everyone's used to. And just more table of contents, looking at the base elements, where many of the instructions for additional, including additional elements, are the same instructions for both authorized and variant forms. So you see some examples for access point for person and access point for place, where you're adding the larger place, and there are all these extra instructions for abbreviation and punctuation and so on, and where those access points are used, whether they're used for the name of government or they're used as just an element, a value for an element. So in terms of the review, which is still going on, this is what I've been working with, and RDAC had some input on this, and it's a matter of just going through, looking at the original toolkit language, looking at how things have been drafted, and putting some fit and finish on these instructions. And there are places where the original language is problematic because you're looking at it and saying, well, that's actually two different options. Or if you establish that as a condition, it's really referring to something else earlier. So you have to fill out that condition box a bit more to make it clear as to what it's referring to. And then there's cases of where to put the references to related instructions. Comments or questions? I figure we're all experts here, so I can leave it at comments maybe.
I just wanted to ask, are you going to be also covering access points for works, expressions, manifestations? Because the focus of your presentation up to now has been on names of persons and also mentioning places.
Oh, I think there was an example for works, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh no, I did all 96 elements.
Right.
Or the base element, yeah.
Okay, so one big difference between the current RDA and the 3R RDA is that you don't have the concept of other distinguishing characteristics anymore. Mm-hmm. You get lots of references to using string encoding schemes in order to create access points. That being the case, is there some means of making sure that the string encoding scheme you choose is actually consistent with the structure of RDA?
That might be a broader RSC question.
Sure.
You can choose any string encoding scheme you want. It's not governed at all by RDA. So the rules for constructing Unicode headings are string encoding schemes, but they're not the only way of doing name authority, as we know. And that's why in RDA we've separated the ideas out. So RDA is not specifying how you construct an access point. It is giving you the current options for continuity and legacy purposes, but they have options that none of it's mandatory. And what we expect to happen as more communities with different practices come on board is that RSC is going to have to review the situation. Do we expand RDA to cover every possibility as options? And already some of these, as Thomas has said, there's an awful lot of options. Or do we propose, not within RDA, but some kind of mechanism for managing string encoding schemes?
Does the current structure provide for identifying the encoding schemes that are used in particular for a particular number.
That is an option in the boilerplate that when on each element page. There's just boilerplate for just what you said.
Hi, I'm Brenndorfer from the University of Chicago Library. You're talking primarily about appellations of RDA entities, right? So what happens with entities that are now, it seems, going to be excluded from the RDA universe, like animal performers or fictitious characters, where they become related entities of RDA entities or whatever? Are there going to be the mechanisms for dealing with the strings for those sorts of entities? Because after all, there are established practices for dealing with them, but if they're falling outside of the sort of domain of RDA entities, then it seems that one would have to create some sort of separate, if analogous, mechanism for.
I think you're answering the question I was going to answer, and others may chime in here. But that's essentially what makes sense, is that you're not precluding anyone from making those instructions or even having them be exactly the same as what appears in RDA. It's just that those aren't RDA entities, and these current options are just for the RDA entities.
And I'd add that RDA won't presume to tell you how to, construct an LCSH string. That's part of LCSH. It's not part of RDA. So we want to make sure that you can point outside of RDA, but we won't tell you that this string encoding scheme that you use, RDA can't define what that has to be.
John Martin in college, and a little over a year ago, I spent about 6 weeks in intensive self-study of the current RDA as a non-NICO cataloger, the creation of authority records and recording a lot of the elements that RDA now supports, say for agents, creators of works, is outside the scope of my abilities. Or authorization to that. I can create local authority records if I wanted to, but they're not going to go anywhere. And I found a need to reprioritize the instructions in RDA around these kinds of things, formulation of headings for names and persons and corporate bodies, and then also for titles. And I say I'm very pleased by what I just saw. It feels, without having looked at it closely, that it's organized much more effectively to the cataloging task of creating that preferred access point string. Even though RDA is ostensibly moving away from dependence on that string, that's still kind of the world we live in, even if we're looking to the future. And it's still the world that some of us will be constrained to by merits of our participation in certain programs that we receive. So, congratulations on your good work.
Nope.
I guess that's fine.
Yeah. I was going to add to that, yes, but your other point, though, it does feel like, oh, this is organized. Oh, now we can jettison it because it's kind of an external thing that could refer back to RDA, but all of these instructions for creating access points, what are they? I mean, just as with subject access points, it's necessary that they're actually taking up so much space here, and they're not just being set. And then you have other agencies that may choose different ways of constructing access points as well. So yeah, so it did feel odd that it had been described, yes, but we're also potentially moving away from access points.
If there are no other questions, we can let Thomas go on to his next presentation.